Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into a completely wild, grueling journey today, one that really pushes the absolute limits of human endurance. Picture this: a group of 6 friends are dropped into literally one of the most unforgiving, brutal environments on planet Earth. We're talking about the frozen Arctic. And they aren't just doing some casual winter camping here. They are trying to survive for 7 full days with practically zero outside resources. In this explainer, we're going to break down the harsh realities they faced, the critical mechanics of cold weather survival, and honestly, the sheer raw willpower it takes to just not freeze to death.
To really wrap our heads around the gravity of this situation, you have to understand their day one reality. They touched down on this completely frozen, desolate landscape covered in 2 feet of snow, and they realized that all they have to survive is what's currently strapped to their backs. That's it. No pre-built cabin, no heavy machinery to clear the snow, and absolutely zero backup heating systems. It's just them and immediate, stark isolation.
Because they are so incredibly vulnerable out there, their survival immediately comes down to a super strict order of operations. The roadmap to staying alive has basically 3 immediate priorities: create a shelter, build a fire, and find food. If they mess up step 1, well, steps 2 and 3 won't even matter, because the Arctic environment will absolutely take them out before the sun comes up on day 2. So, let's look at that very first absolutely crucial objective. Section 1, stranded in the snow, the first challenge. Right out of the gate, the crew faces a pretty brutal trade-off. The sun sets incredibly fast in the Arctic, right? So they had to frantically dig out a snow fort before dark. The resulting shelter was, let's just say, cozy. Actually, scratch that. It was ridiculously cramped. Imagine grown men packed together literally like sardines, unable to even extend their legs. It was easily the worst sleep of their lives. But you have to look at the alternative. Outside, temps are dropping way below zero. Just 10 minutes of exposure to that cutting Arctic wind could literally freeze a limb. So yeah, the snow cave is absolutely miserable, but it is the only thing keeping them from dying. But of course, when you're rushing to pack only what you can physically carry, critical mistakes are going to happen. And one of the team members realized they didn't have room in their bag for the designated quote-unquote poop tent. Now, I know that sounds kind of funny at first, but it actually introduced a genuine, terrifying risk. Going to the bathroom right near their camp could obviously attract apex predators, specifically polar bears. And when you're already noticing weird, unidentified animal tracks in the snow around you, that vulnerability adds a massive psychological weight on top of the physical exhaustion.
And that physical exhaustion really starts compounding once the sun goes down. Which brings us to Section 2, the fight against freezing, battling the elements.
By day 2, those severe temperature drops started taking a very real toll on their bodies. The crew started experiencing frostnip. If you don't know, frostnip is that terrifying stage right before permanent frostbite sets in. Your skin turns completely stark white and you lose all feeling. Chandler, one of the crew members, pulled off his boots and saw that his toes were totally white. So how do you fix that in the wild? Desperate measures. They had to use body heat mechanics. Chandler literally had to stick his freezing bare feet directly into another teammate's armpit just to bring the color back to his toes.
Because the Arctic doesn't just throw cold at you, it throws this brutal cocktail of compounding problems. Normally getting a fire going is pretty straightforward, but an overnight snowfall completely buried their camp. So now they have soaking wet clothes and worse, soaking wet firewood. You combine wet wood with below-zero temperatures, and suddenly, starting a simple campfire becomes this near-impossible life-or-death struggle.
And this is where we see how survival almost always hinges on specialized, out-of-the-box problem-solving. Since all the surface wood was wet, they had to find a dead tree, split it wide open to get to the dry core on the inside, and then carefully shave that dry wood down into these super thin feathers. Doing this creates enough surface area for a tiny spark to actually catch. It was an incredibly painstaking process, but this feather master technique, as they called it, was literally the only thing that eventually sparked a life-saving flame. But man, the harsh irony of survival is that sometimes even your biggest victories can immediately turn against you. In the chaotic rush to finally soak up some of that heat, they huddled way too close to their hard-won fire inside that cramped space. And the result? Someone's pants and jacket literally caught on fire. Their extremely limited, precious winter gear was completely burnt. It is just a perfect textbook example of how one small, split-second mistake can completely jeopardize the entire mission. And through all of this misery, the cold, the burnt clothes, the cramped cave, there is this constant nagging psychological temptation weighing heavily on the crew: the flare gun. A plane flies over their location once a day. If anyone shoots the flare, it's over. They can instantly go home to a warm bed and safety. But there's a catch. If someone taps out, they have to shave their head on the spot right in front of everyone before they can leave. It's this brilliant, brutal mental test. It forces them to weigh their sheer physical suffering against their personal pride and their commitment to the rest of the group.
So, by surviving the cold, they essentially just bought themselves time to face the next huge threat. Let's look at Section 3, the starvation reality, running on empty.
Since they only brought a tiny amount of food, they had to hunt or fish, but the failures just piled up so fast. On day 3, they tried to ice fish on a nearby lake, but the ice was over 2.5 feet thick. That was literally deeper than their ice auger could even drill, so no fish. By day 4, the crew is utterly exhausted and morale is just totally broken. And by day 5, a massive blizzard hits, grounding any chance of an evacuation, and they realize they are down to their absolute last meal.
The math of their desperation here is just terrifying. With basically 3 full days left in the Arctic, they had exactly 1 ration remaining. And we aren't talking about a hearty feast here. Their final meal consisted of splitting a tiny 6-gram protein beef stick among the entire crew. That is a microscopic boost of energy before they have to turn right back around and face a literal blizzard.
Now, you might be wondering, why is this lack of food such an immediate crisis? Because in extreme cold, eating is heating. Without taking in calories, your body physically cannot generate the internal heat it needs to combat the freezing temperatures outside. Since their clothes were already soaking wet from the snow, running out of calories meant hypothermia wasn't just a risk anymore, it was a rapidly approaching certainty.
Facing total failure, the crew knew they had to make one final, completely exhausting push. Let's move to Section 4, breaking the ice, a final push.
Desperate for fish, they flew a drone up and spotted a river way off in the distance, past the lake and through a dense forest. The environmental science here is absolutely vital. You see, lake water is stagnant, which leads to incredibly thick, impenetrable ice, like what broke their spirits on day 3. But river water is constantly moving and churning beneath the surface, which theoretically keeps the ice sheet much thinner. So they bet whatever remaining energy they had on this science.
So they trek through a literal blizzard in snowshoes, burning calories they do not have, and they finally reach the river. As they started drilling with the auger, you could just feel the tension. The hole was getting as deep as an arm and still no water. If the ice was too thick here at the river, they had no backup plan. It was game over. The challenge would be done.
But then, a massive breakthrough. The auger punched through. The ice at the river was only about 8 inches thick. For the first time in days, they finally had a functional fishing hole and a very real chance to secure the calories they so desperately needed to stay alive.
What happened next was honestly one of the most chaotic moments of the entire journey. After waiting for hours in this freezing, howling wind, they finally hook a fish. But as they pull it up through the hole, it pops off the hook right at the lip of the ice. In a moment of pure adrenaline and absolute desperation, the host literally shoves his bare hand straight into the freezing water and catches the slippery fish barehanded before it can swim away. It is insane. That barehanded catch right there perfectly sums up the brutal math of Arctic survival. Think about this. It took a grueling 7 hours of sitting on a frozen river in the freezing cold and wind to secure just 2 fish. 7 hours, 2 fish. But those 2 fish represented a massive hard-won victory. It meant they were finally going to eat, and more importantly, their bodies were going to generate heat.
But catching the food is honestly only half the battle. Surviving the aftermath is just as critical. The team back at base camp knew that the fishing crew was going to return completely depleted and hovering dangerously close to hypothermia. So they sprang into action. They prepared an emergency warming station with a roaring fire and hot water ready to go the exact second the fishermen returned. Only after they stabilized everyone's core body temperatures could they actually take a breath and celebrate their survival.
And that brilliantly illustrates the absolute core takeaway from this entire incredible journey. When all the wood is wet, when the ice is 2 feet thick, when you have absolutely nothing left to eat, human willpower can overcome absolute physical depletion. They didn't just fight the snow and the cold. They fought their own minds. They fought off the temptation of that flare gun every single day just to push through to the end.
Which leaves us with this final thought for today. Seeing the insane toll this took, the frost nip, the starvation, the absolute physical exhaustion of drilling through ice just to find a single meal, it really forces you to look inward. Could you endure 7 days in the Arctic with only what's currently strapped to your back? It's a fascinating, kind of terrifying question of mental and physical endurance. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your curiosity alive.